I feel like society does most successful people a disservice by giving you the next ring. And it starts when we're very little, but it's like, I have to get good grades. Why do I have to get good grades? Because I have to get into a good high school. Why do I have to get into a high school? Because I have to get into a good college. Why do I get into a good college? So I can go get a consulting job or a job at a Fortune 500 or a job at Google, whatever, right? Why do I do that? Well, that's so I can jump up the corporate ladder. Very seldom, until it's too late, do people stop and say, what am I doing all of that stuff for?
Hello, and welcome to Working Your Way, the podcast dedicated to unraveling the journey of being authentic in the workplace. I'm your host, Sandhya Sudhakar, and today is the second episode in our Career Questions series. We created this series to address some of the biggest work-related topics that I'm hearing a lot about, and in the way we do it here at Working Your Way, where there's really no right or wrong answer, but it's really all about what you need to know to make the right decision for you. So in my circles, there seems to be a lot of talk about leaving corporate. Some of it's from the clients that I work with in my coaching business who are craving more autonomy and flexibility, or the ones that eventually want to find something that feels more purposeful than the current jobs that they're doing. Many of them bring it up throughout the process. And there's a lot of talk of leaving corporate where there's not a choice. The layoffs of 2023 and already what we've experienced at the beginning of 2024 have anxiety levels running higher than they ever have before. The safety and stability once offered by big companies just doesn't seem to be there in the same way anymore. So this episode is going to be all about going independent, whether that's freelancing or fractional work or self-employment. There are lots of names for it, and there are a lot of ways to do it. So we're going to talk about what you need to know about independent work, what you should consider if you're thinking about doing it, and how you could take the right steps to make the transition a little bit more easeful. Now, right now, there are more than 7 million independent workers in the US, and about 2/3 of them are doing it full-time. And they're in it for the long haul, which means they aren't just doing this work as a temporary stopgap between, I'm using air quotes here, real jobs. This is their career path. And the world is changing. For many of us, the role of work in our lives is shifting a bit. Maybe it's shifting a lot. And we're also connected via technology, and that creates so much more access and in turn, opportunity to do different things than we've done before or work for different companies in different locations. So in this episode, I'm bringing on two guests to talk about some different elements of independent work. Later in the episode, we'll talk to Sam Lee about building a career as an independent and the company that he started to help other solo practitioners, coaches, and consultants do it in a way that's aligned with their bigger life goals. But first, my first guest is Raj Kapur. Raj is the founder and CEO of And Marketing. We're going to talk about his career journey from corporate to consulting to eventually starting a fractional CMO agency. We also dive into the pros and cons of working for yourself, and I'll just say, he doesn't sugarcoat any of it. And we talk about how he got his first client. So let's get into it. Welcome to Working Your Way, Raj. It's nice to have you on.
Amazing to be here. Thank you so much, Sandhya.
I love the topic we're going to talk about today because I think there are more people than even we know that are ready to leave corporate and go independent for a various number of reasons. And you and I have both gone independent in very different ways. And so I want to talk to you about fractional work and your journey and going independent and then helping other people go independent. However, before we get into that, I really want to talk a little bit about your overall career. So give me a glimpse into what that career path has been for you.
Sure. Before I started this company about 7 years ago, I was in corporate America at really big companies for like 20 years. I sort of saw the underside of bureaucracy and politics. The biggest frustration I had in corporate America was that I found out the hard way that like the best ideas don't necessarily win. And there's other things at play, and there's these unwritten rules that sort of carry the day and that sort of stuff. And finding that out was really heartbreaking for me because I imagined a world where I would work at one of these large companies or multiple of these large companies, make it a career, be really happy and be really successful, because that's what I kind of knew. I'm an immigrant of this wonderful country, right? So like when you come in without having any idea of what entrepreneurship looks like, you just imagine the way things are and the way things might be from your family, and that's what I had experienced. So that was really kind of heartbreaking. So when I was leaving corporate America, I knew I wanted to get out. I just didn't know what I wanted to do. Strategy consulting was really interesting to me, both out of undergrad and out of business school. And it just never sort of lined up. I never found the right company. I never found the right opportunity. I never got the right offer, those types of things. And so I found a small boutique consulting company that was only about 15 or 20 consultants. And they only did one thing. They only did marketing strategy and innovation for large B2B companies. And they were actively looking for people who had corporate experience. And so they said, we could teach you how to be a consultant, but we need people who know what it's like to be on the client side. And I said, well, that's me. So that set me off on a wonderful 4-year journey as a strategy consultant. I really enjoyed so many different parts of it. And that was in a much smaller environment. So it was sort of like a step down. I was still doing the work for large multinational kind of companies, but it gave me the opportunity to be a little bit more entrepreneurial. It was a very small company. I could make a large impact. So I did that for 4 years. That ran its course for a few different reasons. The first one, and the primary one, was deeply personal. The second one was very much related to my professional career, right? So I'm a marketer. And when you're a strategy consultant, what I like to say is you get a PhD in PowerPoint. Like you get really good at writing PowerPoint presentations and telling other people to do work. But in the digital marketing world, it's really about rolling up your sleeves and doing the work. And what I was realizing is in my career, I never really had a chance to roll up my sleeves and do the actual work. A couple of positions that I had at GE were pretty good in terms of tactical and roll up your sleeves, but I never really learned it, right? And so the transformative trend in my chosen career field was right in front of me and I wasn't learning it. So the second big reason was I really wanted to get more digital with my career. And then the third sort of reason was I really wanted to work with smaller companies. So the bureaucracy and politics that I was frustrated at in my corporate career certainly carried over.
You just stayed with it, right?
I just stayed with it, right? Except it had a different face, a different name, and a different logo. And I would punch in as a consultant as opposed to punching in as an employee. So that still stuck. And so I figured, the digital adoption wave was coming for smaller businesses and they were not ready for it. And that's totally true, obviously. So that was the genesis behind starting what ended up becoming the company, because that's a little bit of a different story. But really, I knew I wanted to get out of the working world. I knew I wanted to take a step back. I knew I couldn't travel so much. And I knew I wanted to be much more digital. That's why I originally started the company.
Yeah. And when you were talking about in the corporate world, kind of that moment of recognition of, oh, this is exactly what I thought it was. Like good ideas aren't even coming to the table for a million reasons, right? That maybe aren't important. I can remember the first time that someone told me that corporations exist to make their shareholders rich. And I was like, honestly, I was like, I wanted to cry because I'm like, all of these years that I've been working so hard and feeling like, oh my God, I'm building a career. And at the end of the day, I'm just making some owners rich. It's like a little bit of a slap in the face of reality, right?
It's like finding out, I've never had this fortunately, but it's like finding out that your boyfriend or girlfriend is cheating on you, right? It's like, oh my God, I've been doing all of this for nothing. Like, what am I kind of doing? And that's, it's got to be like that. It's like a little bit of heartbreak. It's a little bit of mind blown. I remember, I can't say it was a specific moment, but it was over the course of multiple moments where I was just like, this is not what I signed up for. And the backstory is that there's an entrepreneur desperate to get out. I make a terrible employee, right? I like to make my own rules. I call myself completely unemployable now, right? At this point, I've been doing it for 7 or 8 years. There's no way I could go into an environment and like go become an employee again. Or maybe I could, I don't know, but it would be pretty difficult. I'd have to switch off a lot of things to do that.
So what was that very first step off of the cliff from like, I'm getting paid by a company of any sort into I'm going to do this on my own?
So I think the first one was I wasn't sure that I was going to do it on my own. That was the first thing. So what I knew was that I didn't want to do that anymore. And I couldn't figure out the next thing until I stopped doing that. because that was demanding. That was traveling all the time and working around the clock and doing all of these things. There was this flurry of activity. So I knew I had to stop that. So I went through about a 6-month period of uncertainty. Unfortunately, I have a very supportive spouse. And I just, sort of said, I need some time to explore and I need some time to figure out what's out there. So I did sort of, I don't know what people call it, but I called it like a coffee tour. Anybody who would take my call, anybody who would take a networking 30 minutes with me, this is before Zoom and all that stuff was so popular, but anybody who would take a call, anybody who would meet me for a coffee or lunch or whatever. And I, bought so many coffees and lunches that I can't even remember the numbers, but just really listening for what is out there. What are the opportunities? What does a sort of professional reset look like? I think I needed that period before I knew that I was going to go start this what ended up becoming the company that I now run. I think that was a very important period for me because I had to weigh all of the different options. Do I want to go start a company? Do I want to join another company? Do I want to go back to corporate America? I was pretty sure I didn't want to go back to corporate America, but as a consultant, it's certainly something that you have to think about, because just because I didn't like consulting doesn't mean I wouldn't like going back to corporate America. So I actually did end up getting a couple of job offers and stuff like that. Like I could have made that path work, and I decided I didn't want to, and I wanted to go a little bit more independent. The initial 3 months was really valuable because I got my sleep back. I got to meet my kids. I got to hang out with my wife. Like all of those things were pretty necessary. I highly recommend that to people who might be going through that. Not everybody is as lucky as I am. I have a pretty supportive system and the finances to be able to do that. So I'm pretty grateful for that experience, I would say.
Now, first of all, I just want to say I really endorse taking a career break if and when you can. Raj was really fortunate to have a supportive spouse and the financial means to do this. And I took a career break too. In a future episode of Career Questions, I'll be talking all about taking a career break or a sabbatical. But regardless of whether or not you take a break, I love this idea of a coffee tour. Meet with lots of people. Explore options and ideas. Read some books and do some self-reflection to figure out what fuels you and what options are out there. Too often, I think we try to figure stuff out all on our own. And the same comes back up when I talk to Sam later in the episode about the value of leveraging your network and building community when you're self-employed. Let's get back to the conversation.
Absolutely. I feel like society does most successful people a disservice by giving you the next ring. And it starts when we're very little, but it's like, I have to get good grades. Why do I have to get good grades? Because I have to get into a good high school. Why do I have to get into a high school? Because I have to get into a good college. Why do I get into a good college? So I can go get a consulting job or a job at a Fortune 500 or a job at Google, whatever, right? Why do I do that? Well, that's so I can jump up the corporate ladder. Very seldom, until it's too late, do people stop and say, what am I doing all of that stuff for?
Yeah, those rings, those ladders, those steps, like I really like the term achievement autopilot, because it's just like, it's right there in front of you. So like, of course you're going to take it. And I mean, that was a big part of my own story, is like, do the thing, get the scholarship, go to school, get the good job, like keep climbing the ladder at the good job until, circumstances put you in a place where you're like, no, and I think that's the thing. It's like, it almost has to be really bad it was for me, at least, it had to be really bad before I said, is there something else I should be doing?
Totally. Achievement autopilot is an amazing way to look at it. I am stealing that. It's also your soul gets sucked a little bit at a time. It's not major decisions. It's not, in order to get this promotion, you have to sell your soul. No, it's not that. It's, okay, for the next promotion, I have to do this thing with my career that I didn't really plan on. And it's just a little sacrifice and I'll just make it for a little time. Or, my kids are little and I have to travel, but the travel's not going to be that bad. I'm just going to do it for a little while. And what hardly ever happens in my experience is you never go back and lose that trade-off. You get another little trade-off compounded. So it's not a big step, but just a series of a million little steps and a little sacrifice you make until you're describing what you described, where it says, wait a sec, how did I get here? Like, I'm not happy. I might have outward success. My LinkedIn and my resume may look fabulous. I might get a 5-star rating or whatever on my latest, but what the heck is it for? And am I really aligning to what I want to do with this, this singular life that I have? It happens. I think it happens all the time. Your podcast and your positioning is an entire testament to the volumes of people that face that as sort of achievement oriented world and maybe take a step back on that.
And for the record, that was not my term. I didn't come up with it. I got it from a book. So we'll just pass it along and pay it forward. But yeah, it's those small shifts away from yourself. But I think the way that you framed it too of like, oh, I'll just make this little sacrifice here. I'll just make this little trade-off here. And the fact that you never actually go back and get that back, but you just add on another trade-off. I mean, that is like, yeah, that's the truth, right? And I think that's how we get so far away from the type of lifestyle we want to live or the type of environment we want to be in or the type of work we want to do, because it's an easy next step right in front of us, but we don't recognize like how those trade-offs add up. So
Absolutely.
Yeah. Raj mentioned these little trade-offs that we make and how they kind of compound on top of each other. When we talk about trade-offs, the idea is that maybe we're giving up something, but we hope to get back something of equal or greater value. These trade-offs could look like the really big emotional energy drains that we've talked about a lot on this podcast. Things like code switching or putting on a persona at work to fit in or be successful, or keeping quiet when things are happening that you feel are wrong, just to make sure that you're seen as a team player or valued by leadership, or keep that position as a high potential within your company's succession planning. But in companies, it can also often look like things like, okay, I'm going to work crazy long hours for a couple of months to achieve this milestone or complete this project. Or I'll relocate to a place that I really don't want to be in order to take this promotion. Or maybe it sounds like I'll come back from parental leave early just to stay on my same promotion timeline. There are so many ways that we make sacrifices to get somewhere in our careers. Now, my question to you is, what have you given up? And more importantly, what have you gotten back in return? Maybe it's a raise or a title or a bigger scope. How much value do those things have for you now? And are they worth what you gave up in order to get there? And to be fair, this isn't only something that happens in companies or in the corporate world. There are plenty of trade-offs in independent work too. It's certainly no walk in the park. For me, if I reflect back on the trade-offs that I've made in building my business, I mean, I may not know yet if a lot of them are worth it, but the thing that stands out for me is that they were intentional and they were on my terms. And I hope that that sacrifice ultimately will benefit both my own business and the impact I can make on others. So I'd encourage you to reflect on the sacrifices that you've made. And do you really feel like that they were worthy trade-offs? Or are there things maybe looking back that you might have made a different decision on? So then today you're running and marketing, you're running an agency. So what were a couple of the kind of big pivotal moments going from, all right, I'm going to have coffee with anyone who will talk to me, explore all my options, to where you are now?
I would say the first one was getting the first client. So what ended up happening was I would go into these conversations specifically asking questions about marketing and digital marketing. So tell me about your problems, tell me about your challenges, Mr. Small Business Owner, what's going on? And they would bring problems and I would propose solutions because I know the industry and I know the market, with no intention of them hiring me to solve the problem. But I'm a salesperson, right? So I'm a pretty good salesperson. I'm pretty good at understanding a problem and then trying to build a helpful solution to that. That's just sort of in my DNA. So after a while, people started hiring me to do the thing, whether I was like able to do it or not. And what I did was, maybe incorrectly, but let's just play it out, right? I was able to say, okay, great, you need this thing done. I don't know how to do the whole thing. Let's pick a website. I signed up very early on, even before I had a company name or anything like that, where I basically figured out that I could sell websites to small businesses, and then I could go find people to build the website, and I had to do the client management, and I did a little bit of the copywriting, but I could basically find people to do all the stuff. So it was like there was this arbitrage between, I just pick a random number, selling a website for $15,000 and finding people to go do the activity for far less. And then the arbitrage between that was what I made, right? So you do a few of those projects and they're just contractors and you're sort of like arm's length, all of that stuff, right? And then after a while, they sort of start relying on you for their income. And they're sort of like, I'd love to continue to be your intern for whatever dollars per hour, but like, I kind of need a job. And then you say, well, okay, well, I have this steady flow of work for you, so I might as well turn this hourly thing into a more formal thing. And then before you know it, it's a job. And then before you know it, you say, oh my gosh, I need to start a company because it can't just be me doing this. They need the recognition. It's got a website, right? Like I had to do a whole different LLC. I had to do all of that stuff, right? So that was a pretty big moment to say, okay, like this is a real thing. And this is going to be what I'm doing with my career, at least for a little while. So that was like Startupville. We didn't have any processes. I'm pretty good at the thing, like the marketing thing, but I don't necessarily know how to do small business finance, accounting, operations, none of that stuff. I didn't know how to do any of that, right? So I basically grabbed, borrowed, and stole contractors and a couple of employees to help build and grow the thing. So that's like find product market fit, find a group of customers, cover your costs, do the very best you can. So that's sort of like the initial startup. And we got to a pretty darn good place, right? Then the pandemic hit, right? So the pandemic was the second sort of major inflection. I remember the day really specifically. It was March 13th, 2020. I specifically remember it because it was a Friday the 13th. And my largest client, it was a $25,000 per month recurring revenue client that went out of business like the first day of the pandemic. Right.
Wow.
So in a business that's not that much, I mean, do the math on that, right? And imagine we only had like 5 employees. Like that was a shock to the system. We'd been in business not even like 3 years. We were just sort of making it. We were, everybody's getting paid, but we're not getting bonuses. Like it's just like we're barely making it. And then this huge thing happens. Now, I didn't know at the moment that this was going to be what it was. Like nobody did. But like that was the moment I sort of said, okay, none of these wonderful people's fault is this pandemic. This thing is not your fault. What I know for sure is if we play offense now, well, everybody else is retracting and playing defense. We're going to be better off. Like I'd read all the books, like all the strategy books say to do that, right? When there's a market disruption, play offense. So I did. And so over the course of the next 6 months, at the sacrifice of my personal life, right? Because the pandemic was hell for everybody. We basically built the business back up better than ever. So now we're a better company. We have, people that are a better fit, better finances, and better processes because we made so many mistakes the first time. We could look back and sort of correct them. That inflection point was important because in the course of a couple months, I lost a bunch of clients because of underperforming employees. So that was the next big lesson I learned was that I was entrusting people way too much. And then before it was too late, like usually it got to a point where I could just fix it and we couldn't fix it anymore. And we lost a bunch of clients. And what I really realized the problem was I was not providing the right direction and oversight and client management to be able to sustain a growing business like the way we were, right? So we replaced some people. And most importantly, I made the decision to start the fractional CMO practice. Like that's the offshoot of that is we had an execution business. I was the acting fractional CMO for all of these different clients. And I couldn't figure out a way to not be the fractional and give that responsibility to somebody else. That was a really hard moment. So what I basically said was, hey, I have some friends who are pretty good at marketing. They have pretty good experience. What if I brought you clients, you manage them, and our team, the execution team who's doing a really good job, does the work? That sort of started working and spinning and working and spinning. I did a bunch of research, both sort of official research and sort of one-on-one interviews to learn that this term fractional CMO is a real thing, right? It's a real thing. It's got name recognition. There's a couple of real competitors. There's definitely a market need, but that's like a real thing. And what I would say to other consultants or other people that might be listening is there was a moment at which what I realized was I was working my butt off to go get commodity execution work for other people to do. And it started this horrible treadmill where I was working really hard to give away the strategy to keep other people busy. And as soon as I switched that to say, well, the actual value is that I can bring in clients and I can build really good strategy, that changed everything forever. That was like a really important moment because what that gave me permission to do was just go sell strategy for companies that need it on its own and not really couple it with the execution work, right? So again, around the middle of 2021, this was an idea formulating. Fast forward 2 years, 2.5 years, fractional CMOs. Now we have a group of 55 fractional chief marketing officers with a whole big diverse group of different industries, different backgrounds, experience with different company stages. And it's now more than 50% of our revenue, right? So like that pivotal moment in the middle of 2021 where all of that happened sort of sparked something that has totally changed the face of the company and everything like that. So I'd say those are the few areas where we had to make kind of some big decisions.
So let's shift gears. So what is fractional work? Let's define this. It's becoming a term that I'm hearing a lot more. We're seeing it pop up in articles, and a lot of people talk about the future of portfolio careers and fractional work and all these things. So what is it?
Yeah, I actually heard somewhere this being called 2024 being called the year of the fractional, right? So I don't know what the previous years were, but like if it's even going to emerge even more. So I think the whole concept is twofold. You have a bunch of people who are very qualified who do not want full-time jobs. Maybe it's the pandemic, maybe it's something else. Who knows what the reason is? Well, there's probably a few different root causes. Is people are tired of corporate unfulfilling careers. People may not be able to find full-time jobs to do everything they want. People have a humongous need for flexibility. But the number one thing is there's a humongous workforce out there that doesn't want the traditional 9 to 5. That is generational, right? As we move from Gen X to millennials to Gen Y, like it's going to happen more and more where people don't want that thing where they go into the same office at the same time for 25 years, punch their clock, do their job, and go home. People don't want that, right? And the ladder and the achievement and everything we talked about isn't that important at its core for the workforce. Pair that with companies don't necessarily want full-time employees anymore either, right? So many companies are very willing on an incremental basis to pay more for just the thing they want without the baggage of a full-time employee. They want people to do a job for the lowest possible cost and as variable as possible. So once that project is done or once that thing is done, I don't necessarily want to keep that cost going. So I think the root is that there's this natural match of a labor force that wants something different and the employers who want the work done and don't necessarily want the burden of a full-time employee. For anybody who has been on either side of a layoff, those suck. Those are awful. It's awful to lay people off. It's awful to get laid off. So like, how can you avoid that? You can avoid that by being more clear up front that this is not a full-time job. It's not this. It is just this thing for this project or this amount of time. Now, a few companies have sort of tagged on to this fractional concept. I believe it actually started in finance, where fractional CFOs realized that smaller companies didn't need a full-time CFO. They just needed somebody for X amount of hours a month or a week to do your books, to do your stuff, to give you advice, and then see you later. And then that really smart finance person said, well, if I could do that for this company, I could do it for 10 companies and I could be fine. And I'm not too busy or whatever like that. So I think it started with the finance industry and it sort of started spreading to other places. So I think that's the root of what a fractional is. It's a full-time brain when you're working, and then it's not, you don't have to pay for that person the rest of the time when they're not.
I think it's interesting, and I'm sure this applies to a lot of other functions, but especially with marketing, how quickly it's changing, how specialized it can be. If you think about, we really just need to focus on SEO, or we really just need to focus on like one particular piece of marketing, to hire an entire person to do that doesn't necessarily make sense, right? And so often I would say companies maybe have gone to agencies on project-based things. Is that fair to say? And like,
totally.
How is that different than bringing in someone fractional?
Yeah. So let me first say, I think you nailed it. Part of the problem in marketing is that marketing could mean a ton of different things. So marketing could mean strategy. It could mean copywriting. It could mean SEO. It could mean graphic design. It could mean social media. It could mean paid ads. It could mean Google ads. It could mean like all of these different things.
Yeah.
And oh, by the way, all of those different things are different skill sets. So like a graphic designer could be really good at marketing, but they're totally different than somebody who manages your Google ads, totally different person. So for a small company, you might get two of those skill sets in the same human. You're definitely not getting all 8 or 10 or however many I described, right? So I think that's the first part that's unique about marketing that says I can't just hire a marketing person, right? The paradigm usually is when you get big enough, you hire a marketing manager for your business, 25-year-old kid, very energetic, and they're the marketing person. Well, what I just said was they can only do a couple of those things. So what do you do with the rest? This is where agencies come into play, right? So playing the role of the agency, I can see it from both sides. It's really difficult. The problem with marketing agencies is that any 25-year-old kid with a Mac can call themselves a marketing agency. There's no barrier to becoming an agency. And so what ends up happening, and I hate to say it this way, but like 80% of marketing agencies suck, right? They do not understand how a company makes money, and they cannot figure out how their work helps that company make more money. So any business owner, many business owners have faced this frustration, but any business owner that is considering an investment in marketing through an agency wants to know that if I hire this agency, sign this retainer, and do all this work, at the end of it, I'm going to make more money than I spent. Otherwise, it's pointless. So the frustration that exists, particularly in smaller companies, is that it's impossible to get the strategy and the execution of all of those different things under one roof, yet the value proposition that they're selling is there. Now, larger companies who have larger budgets have access to agencies with more resources. So that makes up that 20% of really good agency. They do good work, right? They do good strategy. They do good execution. They get the work done and all that stuff, but you're going to pay for it. Now you move into the middle market. They don't have the funds to be able to afford tens of thousands of dollars a month to hire a strategist and all of those different things. So I think that is a really good definition of the problem that exists, particularly in marketing. Like you can't just go hire an agency, because if you hire an agency, what are you going to get? You're going to get 3 to 6 months. They may or may not work. You're frustrated. They are frustrated. Oh, but you signed a long-term contract, so I have to stick around for a year. Well, that's horrible. Like you never want to do that. So I came in very early with an anti-agency positioning because I knew the frustration. I always tell my prospects, I fired more marketing agencies than you have. I promise you that. So I know exactly how frustrating it can be to hire somebody, have an expectation, and then have them not deliver on it. It's really frustrating.
What I'm picking up from what you're saying is like, it is that middle layer of, okay, we have everything in-house, people that are, air quotes, committed to the company and the longevity and the prosperity of this place. But do we have all the specialization that we need? And then there's kind of the like, okay, we hire out on a project basis where that seems to be missing the context. Like, where does this fit into the bigger picture? Is this even the right project to be doing? Like, how do you know you should be spending money on Google ads? Like all of those things, right? So I think what I'm hearing is when we think about fractional work, it's like that middle ground of really understanding the strategy, even developing the strategy with the company, and also being able to then like bring on the executional specializations that are needed.
Yeah. And what I often say is that a really good fractional can probably execute some of the work, but it's not the best spend for your budget. Because you could pay me to do your Facebook ads or do your Facebook updates, but that's just not a good spend, right? So having that, I love the idea of that. I would say best of both worlds or middle ground is perfect, because that person comes in, learns the business, puts everything in the context of what the business is trying to do, and then manages all the resources that usually the company leadership who doesn't have a marketing background is not equipped to do anyway. So it ends up being this large vacuum that a fractional CMO can fill pretty well.
So if there's someone out there listening that works in corporate right now, say they're a marketing director or a finance director or a salesperson, and they're like, I don't want to work in corporate anymore. I want to go independent. What's one way that they could say, okay, fractional is the right thing for me to think about?
Every week at least, either a friend or a friend of a friend calls me and says, teach me about this fractional thing. The number one piece of advice I tell them is, it's a lot harder than you think. So let's assume that you being good at finance or marketing or whatever the career is, let's just assume you're good at that. I don't question that at all. You've been doing it for 20 years. You've been doing it for all these great companies. Let's just assume that's totally right. The biggest paradigm shift that somebody who's considering going independent or going fractional is that the product is now you, and your job is to sell the product. You are no longer in the business of doing the thing, doing the marketing, right? You are now in the business of selling a service that is called marketing. Most really good marketing people stink at sales. Most really good finance people stink at sales. Most really good fill in the blank career stink at sales. I would even argue most really good corporate salespeople stink at sales for themselves. So what I usually tell them to do is really think about it and try to find a way to experiment or test before they jump in whole hog. Can I actually do this? That's the first layer, right? Like sort of get your head check. It's really quite difficult. Get the paradigm shifted. I think the second thing is people who have the comfort of a paycheck can get over not having a paycheck easier than not having a team to help with stuff. Okay. So not having people around you. I say it's literally and figuratively taking out your own garbage. I can physically take out my own garbage, but all of the things that it takes to run a business as an independent take up a lot of time, and they're not my skills. So like having something that does that for you or a way to get rid of that is way more mentally taxing than I think people necessarily recognize. So I'll give you a great example. I was talking to somebody with a great corporate career. They were the marketing leader for a single-digit multi-billion-dollar division of a really large company. Okay, and so I was trying to talk them through what it's like to work with companies with far less resources. So I said, give me an example of a project that you ran or did where you did something with very limited resources. And she said, yeah, I had a great experience. I launched a product. I only had 5 or 10% of like 15 people. So it was really hard to get them rallied around this launch. And I said, you just said you had access to all those resources. What if you didn't? And she said, well, how would I launch it? And I said, that's what I'm asking you, right? Because that's what it means to truly be without resources. Like you don't have that network of people that are going to help you with the thing. You have to sort of learn how to be very scrappy. And I think that talks about how hard it is for people that come from larger companies to think about what it's like to go to smaller companies that have far few resources. It just becomes really difficult. It's not just a cultural class. It's sort of like it's like a global worldview that large multinational companies have that maybe people who are independent or work with smaller companies don't have.
So I am one of those people, right? Like I was in sales at P&G for years and years. And now selling my own business is the hardest thing that I do, right? And it's because it's just so different working with a retailer to go to market on a big brand and me being my business and my product and all the weird emotional roller coaster stuff that goes along with that, right? And rejection of a proposal is like personal rejection, like all these crazy things that are part of this process. But it's a matter of like, for me, as you think about it, was I good at it? No. Am I figuring it out? Sure. I'm working on it. And am I figuring it out in a way that works for me, that I feel good about, that I feel authentic doing? Like that's an even harder part of it. And so I think, while people aren't maybe inherently good at that or don't have that skill set, it's not something that can't be built, but it's one of those things where it's like, do you want to build that skill set? Like you can, but are you choosing to, right? When you go independent, like that's a consideration that not everybody really thinks about. And I certainly didn't, because I jumped in optimistic and hopeful. And then I was like, oh crap, I got to do a lot of things that I didn't think I was going to do.
It's a lot hard, right?
This is probably the area where I was most surprised when I went the independent route. I started a business to do work that I love. And now I have to run the business that allows me to do work that I love. That means accounting and bookkeeping, taxes and legal contracts. It means determining the best marketing strategy and finding potential clients. I have to be proactive about sales and creating proposals and have conversations to quote unquote close business. It's a lot. And certainly as an independent, you can outsource some of these things eventually. For me, I held on to a lot of it early on so that I could understand what needs to be done. And I could be intentional about what choices that I was making today and for the future. For example, on how I run my business from a financial standpoint. At the beginning, you don't always know what you don't know, and you don't know what you can or should pay for support on. And you don't necessarily have the cash flow to pay for it, even when you want to. For me, I wanted to experience it all firsthand and then find a structure that worked for me that felt more sustainable. It's how I operate best, being deep into the details until I have enough context to take a step back and make choices. And in independent work, it's all possible. It just requires a lot of effort in those early stages. So if you're still listening, that means we didn't scare you away yet. So let's talk about what's amazing about going independent.
So the advice I give to people is like, really think about how hard it is and all the other things. Like, you're good at sales, no doubt, right? Like, if you wanted to go start a service that helped Fortune 500 companies with it, you could do that. But the work that it takes to get there is hard, right? And it's lonely, and you got to take out your own trash figuratively, and right? There's nobody you can forward that email to that, the taxes are due. You can't just forward that to your finance division because you're the finance person, right? And you have to wear all the hats. It's totally true. You say it really well.
Yeah. And then what are the upsides of all of those difficult parts of it?
Well, what are the upsides? Well, I make my own schedule. I do whatever I feel like is important. I mean, I have responsibilities because I have a team and I'm accountable to that team. So we have created mechanisms where I can't just do anything I want. I can't sleep until 10 o'clock every day. Not that I would, right? So what are the upsides is that you get to set the tone for everything, right? There's a responsibility that comes with that. But sort of when you are the driving force behind a company or a thought, you get to go do that. You have to answer to yourself and you're accountable for those things. But on the other side of it, there's a certain amount of power that goes with it, right? One of my personal goals is I want to take a vacation every 3 months. Like, I couldn't do that in corporate America. I mean, I might be able to do it in corporate America, but that would take some massaging, but I can do that because I run my own company now, right? And I get to have that flexibility. So I get to decide what this thing called a career becomes a lot easier than if I was in a corporate structure or something like that. So I think that's a big one. I have worked from home or quote unquote worked from wherever for now 13 and a half years, right? So my middle son was born the week I took a new job at GE, and I've never worked in an office since then. So building a career around a life is a switch that I wasn't aware of, but now I wouldn't know any other way.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It's like the big rocks that go into the jar and the things that you design around, right? And it's like, put life in there first and then figure out how the career works around it. It's certainly not something that we're encouraged to think about or to do. And when you start doing it, it's hard to go the other way. I can certainly relate to that. So I think a couple of the other, I mean, you mentioned this, right? Like the flexibility that you have, the autonomy that you have. Like, it's interesting to me that in my own journey, like, I don't think that I understood just how important autonomy was to me until I had full autonomy. And I had a step in between corporate and here where I was really like, I wrote my own job description. I was like asking for budget on exactly what I wanted to and all these things, right? So it was an in-between step where I was like, oh, I can just come up with what I want to work on and ask for it. And I have this high level of trust from my leadership, but also a huge amount of autonomy in it. And now thinking about that, going back, it's like to choose who you want to work with and how you want to do it and find clients that do have that good natural fit with how you do work well and the type of work that you do. It's a huge upside of doing this type of work. So if we talk about going independent, there's going fully independent, just, as a freelancer, as a 1099, you contract, you find your own clients, you do everything yourself. And then you've got folks that work for you or in your organization as fractional. So what would you say are the pros and cons of doing it fully yourself or doing it within some other kind of structure like
Sure.
an and marketing?
Yeah, so we've created a community. So let me take a step back. I made a conscious decision because of what I knew about the labor force to go a certain way. Okay. So there are many other fractional CMO companies. Almost all of them are what I call captive. And what I mean by captive is once you sign on with them, you are exclusive to them. Okay. And that's okay. Like you can have that. I wish them luck and it's totally fine. But what I found is a huge gap in the labor force that doesn't want to be held captive. Very simply, right? So, for example, what I mean by that is if you're signed on with one of these fractional CMO types of companies and you go source a project yourself, you still give a large percentage of the revenue to that company. Okay. There's a lot of people for all the right reasons that don't believe that's fair. Full stop. Right. So if I'm doing all the work and everything like that, why would I give you a percentage of revenue? So what I found is a really healthy group of fractional CMOs that do not want to be held captive to the company. Now, we may change the model in the future, but for at least a foreseeable future, the next year or two, we're not changing from that, right? We're going to allow independence to stay independent. Our job is to go get you projects, right? So how do we solve that? Is we create a community. We try to provide a ton of value to that community. And we do several things, include bringing warm leads to you, right? We do demand generation. Then we bring that to our community. There's an application process. You apply for a job. If you get the job, you get it, and we get a percentage of the revenue. That's how our model works, right? So structuring the community in a certain way is that. So I like, for the fractional CMOs out there, I like to maintain that person's independence and flexibility. We recently did a survey in November where we asked our fractionals what they preferred. They said there was two things that were far and above the top two things. Number one is we bring real qualified leads. If you go back to what we talked about, most really good marketing people do not like the demand generation part of that. So we bring leads to the community, right? So that's number one. By far, that was the top. The second one is that they love to remain independent. We don't tell you how to do your job. We don't dictate. We don't force price. We don't do any of those things, right? We allow that fractional to be a good marketer once they're on their project. And we're there to help, certainly, but we're not there to dictate. So we like to maintain that independence.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense. Again, it's kind of that like fully independent, fully within an agency. And then there's kind of this middle ground, right?
Sure.
Of you could do some projects with you. And now you've built a big enough community that you're always able to assign the work to somebody or to match that person with the client. But there's also some choice in it for them around like, oh, I'm not even going to go after that opportunity.
Absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. Right. So we're never going to force it. So we often get an opportunity and I'll tap, because I interview every single member of the community. I know them. I get to know them personally. I get to know them really well.
Yeah.
So I'll say things like, hey, person X, I'm surprised you didn't apply for this position. More times than not, they will say, oh my gosh, I didn't even see it. Like, oh my gosh, I missed it. Or, we send communications 3 ways. We do all of that stuff. Oh my gosh, I missed it. I was just busy. I was doing something else. Or they said, no, I made a conscious decision. I'm too busy right now. I'm not taking on more work, or it's a busy period for me personally, or things. I found, and maybe this is a little bit of a tangent, but it might be worth mentioning. Fractional CMOs, I find, I'm always segmenting. So I think about a few different groups of fractional CMOs. There's one group of people that is really good, that is full-time fractional. They have made the professional decision that they're going to be a full-time fractional. Great. That's their career. They are never going back to corporate. They want to make a run at that as a career. There's a second group of people that is what I would call fractional curious. So they say, I am going to go try to become a fractional while I look for other opportunities. That's okay too, right? You could say I'm in a waiting period. Maybe I get laid off from my previous job. Maybe I got sick of it and quit. Maybe whatever the reason is. I'm in a waiting period in my life and I'm trying to figure out what that is. I correlate that with a lot of people who are trying to start their own business, like an entrepreneurial venture, and they have a bunch of bandwidth. Like that could work too, right?
Yeah.
There's a third group that have some other life happenstance. So it could be that they're a part-time worker in a company. They have a role, but it's not 40 hours. It could be that they have a personal family commitment, like a sick parent or a special needs kid or something like that. When they say, I can't work full-time, but I've got 20 to 30 hours that are flexible, and I'm willing to do that. So that's a totally different flavor. Any of those flavors are great for us because we like to meet the fractionals where they are. We are interested more in like the awesome 20 years of experience that you have and the contribution you can make, not that you fit neatly into the exact box that we're looking for.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. It's like there's other things going on outside of that work, and this can fit into that gap. So
yeah, absolutely.
Well, I'm going to kind of wrap us up here, but I'm really curious. Is there any other advice that you would have for people who are looking to leave corporate and explore options?
I think the biggest advice, besides getting your head checked and really understanding how hard it is, I would say go on a little bit of a tour to understand how good you actually are and how hireable you are. You know you're good enough to do the job that you're doing today in the company that you're doing today, but it is always a good idea to check your pulse on your value outside. So most people don't love networking. Most people don't like getting outside of their own day to day, but it's like if you can think of 10 people you'd like to take out for coffee or for lunch just to understand what different careers are like and what that path could look like for you, you're almost always better off because it might just reinforce you're quite happy where you are. So I'd be happy to take phone calls like that. Hey, I'm curious and I'll talk about it. But everybody has a network of people. Talk to them maybe every 6 months. Just keep your feelers out there, understand what else is out there, and it'll either reinforce that what you're doing is right or it might be time to make a change. I'd say that's probably the number one piece of advice I could offer.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. And I would say that I'm somebody who thinks anybody can do anything if it's an intentional choice, right? I think it's a matter of, do you want it and are you willing to do the things that it takes to get there? But I also think there is, and this comes from now a couple of years of people saying, wow, you're so brave. And I'm like, I guess maybe I am. I guess maybe more. I think like I'm not very risk averse. And I think there is an inherent personality that values stability and security more than maybe I do. And it's something to consider, right? I think that's really at the end of the day, it's something to consider. I think anyone can do anything. And some people might be a better natural fit for the kind of ups and downs and the uncertainty that goes along with.
I think that's right. I think that's very good advice, right? So I don't think people look in enough mirrors and I don't think people do enough self-reflection, right? Clearly you have, that's what makes you amazing at what you do. But I think people don't take the time to be self-reflective. And there's a great quote about an unexamined life, right? Like examine your own life and spend time looking in the mirror and it'll be really interesting what you find. So
great. Well, thank you so much for being on and sharing your wisdom and a bit about your career journey too.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure. I can't even believe the time has gone by as it's been a real pleasure. And congratulations on all of your success, Sandhya.
Thank you. I told you before, I promised an unfiltered take on going independent from Raj. I think he did a great job of laying out how fractional work, and frankly, any kind of independent work, can work for people in a variety of different circumstances. Whether you have life circumstances that require you to be flexible and available for the other people in your life, if you're in between full-time jobs, or if you actually want to give it a go full-time. I think there's benefit in people dipping their toe into independent work just to open up their minds to that possibility, or to have some type of stopgap or a backup plan for when life is just really lifing. My next guest is Sam Lee, who has extensive experience in independent work. He started IndeCollective, and if you have ever told me that you're interested in going independent, I would be shocked if I haven't already told you about IndeCollective. Sam calls IndeCollective the modern MBA for independent workers. It's a cohort-based program that takes you through everything you need to know to have a successful solo business that aligns with your professional and personal goals. So that looks like creating a vision and identifying the type of clients that are the best fit and productizing and pricing your services well, all the way through to sales and marketing and managing your mindset and the back end of your business. It's been a huge enabler for me in building my business, helping me streamline what I do and how I do it, and offering a pretty amazing community of people you can lean on or collaborate with. Sam and I talk about the different types of independent work outside of just fractional work and how to build the skill sets you need to build and run a successful business. Welcome to Working Your Way, Sam. I'm excited to have you here.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. So why don't we start out by, I want to hear a little bit about your story in going independent.
Yeah, absolutely. So my background professionally has been in sales leadership and commercial strategy. Been doing it with big and small companies alike for 2+ decades now. And about a decade ago, for the first time, a company that I wasn't working for full time approached me to help them with a project. And it was at that point that on the side, I did my first consulting engagement. And what I found in that first project, what has kept me excited about consulting over the last 10+ years, is that it was just a really neat opportunity at that point, alongside a full-time job, to take what I had learned and to test it out in new settings, to test it out in a new industry, at a company at a different stage, to kind of challenge myself, but also to take some of the stuff that I knew I had as a superpower and share it with others. And that first project, which came out of left field, has subsequently turned into dozens of other projects I've worked on, sometimes on the side, like that first project. Other times in the last 10 years, I've actually been a full-time consultant because I've not had a full-time job that's occupied the bulk of my time. So that's how I started. It was really on the side and it was quite happenstance. And over the 10 years, I've really put a lot of time into thinking about what is my offering? How do I position to the right clients? How do I productize that work, that superpower that I can deliver so it's more impactful for the client and also more scalable, requires less of my time to deliver? How do I mobilize my community so I'm not doing projects in isolation, but really tapping into the great network I've built over the course of a career? So those are all things that have by and by been priorities for me and have kind of come to bear in the curriculum we've built around IndeCollective. But it honestly started as a side hustle, as it does for so many, and has snowballed into something that I've been able to do on the side or do full time as is needed in my career at the moment.
So before you kind of had that first opportunity, for lack of better words, kind of land in your lap, did you have thoughts or desires of becoming an entrepreneur?
I really hadn't, to be totally frank. I'd always loved working as an entrepreneur, so working within companies on entrepreneurial projects, but I didn't think that I necessarily had the risk tolerance to go out alone. And having now over the last 10 years talked to well over 1,000 people that have made the leap, and 500 of those have done IndeCollective with us, I found that so many share that limiting belief that because they've worked in bigger or smaller companies with a support system around them, they fear that they probably can't figure out those aspects of building a business that have been necessarily supported by complementary functions. I've never done sales. Could I find those leads? Could I convert those customers? I've never built my own brand. Could I do that from the ground up? I've never structured an offering, right? Like I've delivered an offering if I'm, on the front line, but I've never structured it and figured out how you phase that with a client. So those are some of the things that I think, because many folks have not had to do them in the course of their day in, day out as a corporate worker, they fear there's probably not a playbook for that, or I couldn't figure that out on my own. So those are some of the reasons why it didn't seem to make much sense to me to go out independent before I took on that first project. But because something hit my lap and because it did feel well suited to the skill set I had, I went ahead and gave it a shot. And the truth is, after that first engagement, I was far from a perfect consultant. It was a fun exercise, and it was a really neat opportunity to take what I had been doing at a very late stage internet company and translate it into an earlier stage startup that was working in the internet space. So it's a really neat assignment, I think impactful for the client and interesting for me. But I learned in that first assignment, and I saw in subsequent assignments that I did on the side at that time, that there was a lot of things I didn't know how to do, right? And mentors that I needed to tap into, playbooks that I needed to learn. So I wasn't reinventing the wheel on those important building blocks of business. And those building blocks of business are the things that help somebody who's excellent at what they do, whether you're a coach, a lawyer, a sales leader, a marketer, translate that craft that you've developed over a decade or decades into a very impactful income generating business. So it did take me time to learn those building blocks, to create my brand, to productize my services, to learn how to sell not a big, splashy, big company product offering, but my own. But once you have those playbooks, the right mentors, you can get on a faster path than it took me, right? It shouldn't take you years to figure that out. In fact, you can figure it out in months.
I think it's interesting. You brought up kind of some of these limiting beliefs that people might have around like, oh, I've never done that before. Like, how would I even start that? And for me, in my own entrepreneurial story, I never wanted to be an entrepreneur. I mean, I was at the most corporate of corporate places, and then I left to do something that was much more kind of fast paced, like rapid growth, more startup-y type of environment. And I loved it. And I loved the autonomy that came along with it and just how resourceful I discovered I could be. But I still had no intention of working for myself until it kind of actually happened to me. Similar to, that first opportunity for you. I was out doing workshops for fun and traveling. And my first client was somebody who was in a workshop that said, hey, would you do that for my team? But the thing that was interesting is as I was traveling on my sabbatical, I saw people who were working for themselves in ways that I just hadn't imagined it before. I think I had this picture, this caricature in my head of like entrepreneurship equals living in my mom's basement and eating ramen noodles. And I just wasn't willing to sacrifice my lifestyle, the corporate lifestyle that I had come to have with the salary. And I was like, no, I like nice things. I can't be an entrepreneur. And that kind of busted the myth for me to see all these like digital nomads or people doing like really unique things.
You know this because I share it whenever we kick off an IndeCollective cohort. But the thing that just kind of blew my socks off after for years having done, independent consulting on the side. So as the side hustle, when eventually I did it for the first time full time, which was not necessarily a conscious choice as much as I needed to, right? I had lost the big corporate job in a restructuring. And I realized, I could either have my tail between my legs and chase that next opportunity with hurry, or I could instead bring what was on the side into the foreground and allow myself a deliberate process and even see if I wanted to make a full-time go at it. And I ended up doing for the next about 3 years, full-time consulting on that front burner. And in the first 6 months, what I found is that I made more than I did in my full-time executive, C-level role. And I did it in half the time. So far from ramen, far from living in the parents' basement, I was able to free up a ton of free time and also make more than I did in that full-time executive role. And it was because I had the craft that I developed over many years. And at that point, far enough down my own journey, I had put in place those building blocks of business, those things that allow you to translate the craft into a more productized offering that's value-based price that you can attract clients around, right? It's a marriage of those two things. I don't think anybody should be doing the ramen and living in a basement when you're at this stage of your career, right? When you are great at your craft and, you have a lot of value to bring to the market. So there is a better way, I think.
So I want to pause here for a second just to offer a little more context. Sam is coming from the perspective of doing what you've been doing in corporate and taking it independent. Having a skill or craft that you've honed over years or even decades within an organization and building a solo practice around that or something like it. This is actually not what I did. I made a pretty big pivot from doing product-based go-to-market work, sales strategy, and marketing to coaching and consulting and speaking on leadership development, team dynamics, and culture. I went back to school and got some certifications to build the foundation that I needed first while I was dabbling in client work because of this big shift. What I did in corporate is not what I do now. And because of that, in full transparency, it's taken longer than a few months to get where I am in terms of income and client base because it required a lot more to develop my offerings and find those initial clients. No one knew me for this type of work. And most of the people who knew me in previous chapters of my career didn't even know that I had made a big career change or that I was doing this type of work now. That being said, I had some equity with a lot of people from my years within organizations. And a handful of my early clients came from people that I worked with in my corporate days who knew me in my capacity as a leader or a manager. But it took some work to build visibility with my network of what I was doing now. My point here is this. The process can be quite different if you aren't translating your corporate work into independent work. But even though it may take more time and effort, it's still possible. And I'm an example of making a bigger pivot and going independent with it. So as we get back to the conversation with Sam, we're going to dive into the different ways to structure an independent business. So one of the things that I saw while I was in IndeCollective and have since in building kind of a network of entrepreneurs is there's just a lot of different ways to be, quote unquote, independent or to be an entrepreneur when you're not, founding a company per se or selling a physical product, but when you're doing service-based work. So can you help me kind of break down what are the different ways that you can be an independent or solopreneur?
Absolutely. So I like to think of two sides of the house that you're kind of addressing, and it all comes down to you and your preference, right? Like, how do you want to leverage your skills? How do you want to deliver impact for clients out in the world? Say the first dimension that I think about is, are you doing one or both of the two things? Are you coaching or are you consulting? And you can do both. They're not mutually exclusive, but they're two different delivery formats in terms of how you engage with clients. The other dimension that you want to be thinking about is also like, are you going as an independent, like truly working as a solopreneur, as a one man, woman, or person band? Or are you going to be working in more of a collaborative format? And that collaborative format can range from, we call them collectives, working loosely with other independents, where perhaps there'll be an interesting project that you and other people might pitch and close and work on together on a one-off basis. Or you might decide, gosh, I really enjoy working with these people. They flank me really well. We complement each other nicely. And you create a formal arrangement where in every project, you're pitching, closing, and doing that work together. So those are the two sides of the house. I say, are you coaching? Are you consulting? And you can do both, but you want to be focused in what you bring to market in terms of an offering. And then how collaborative do you want to be? Do you want to just tackle everything alone? Or do you want to move down that continuum of working collaboratively, either in a loose format or in a more formal format? And regardless of your offering, coaching and consulting, or the format of delivery, there are those building blocks of business that I referenced that can help you to get more scalable in your impact, your income, and your free time. And no matter which of the formats, coaching or consulting, or how collaborative you are, those building blocks of business apply, right? And if you think of the formal MBA, that 2-year degree that so many people get, particularly those working in corporate settings, it's the same building blocks that you learn in an MBA, but for independent coaching and consulting, they need to be kind of tailor-made so they're relevant to us.
I think when we talk about going independent or, doing your own thing, it's always like, oh yeah, I want to do this work with these type of people. But what's underestimated is often all the things it takes to actually run that business, right? The back end, the bookkeeping, the sales and marketing parts of it. If that's not what you're naturally doing, those things, like you mentioned before, can be maybe a deterrent to even try to do that. And so I'm curious, like before IndeCollective was an option, what were the ways that you went about doing that?
A fun stat, I think that's worth sharing, because I'm sure there's some listeners today that are wondering, gosh, like, am I ready to take the leap, right? Could I make a real go of this? Upwork and Edelman Research for 10 years now, and in COVID, the same, have run a report on the independent workforce. And they look at everybody from the traditional gig worker, who we think of as somebody, doing DoorDash or Uber or Lyft, to, very high-end, white-collar professional services leaders who are going and doing that independent coaching and consulting. So they look at the full gamut. And in COVID, when there was a surge of independent workers, folks who were going independent, by and large, not by first choice, but by second or third choice. They either needed to for family reasons because they couldn't show up at offices when there was return to work policies, or for personal reasons. They realized, gosh, I can monetize myself and generate more impact while doing it on my own terms. What they found in that surge of workers over the last few years is that on average, within 6 months, about 70% of people are making as much as they were when they were working full-time as they now are independent. And most of those people are gaining the flexibility, whether it be work from home, whether it be flexible hours, that they weren't able to achieve in those more structured corporate settings. So the headline there is that we worry a bit too much. Even if you don't have all the building blocks of business, I keep coming back to this, in place, just like I didn't have them all in place when I started, guess what? You have 80% of them. You have 80% of them because you're smart, you know your craft, and you'll figure it out. So, I was fortunate when I started getting more serious about the consulting. It wasn't just, oh, this interesting opportunity is falling into my lap, but I'd like to cultivate more of these types of interesting opportunities where I can be impactful and I can make some, side income, etc. That's where I started looking to my left and right and seeking out folks in my network who had built meaningful independent consultancies and coaching practices. And not all of them had every one of those building blocks figured out, but based on their skill set, they had a strong a strong strength in at least one or two of them that they could share. So whether it be Mark Rickmeyer, who's a fantastic software developer, agency builder, who is one of the ultimate folks when it comes to activating network, or whether it be, Josh Neckes, who's just one of the smartest people I know about communicating value, whether it be in the offering you create or in the rates that you charge, or on down the line, Allison Davis, who's one of the smartest leaders that I know when it comes to asking smarter questions and proactively leading sales conversations and very confidently sending proposals that are going to command your worth. I just looked into my network and I realized that I had about a dozen people who had built really successful businesses before me who I could turn to fill in some of those building blocks that I didn't have. So that's kind of how I started to just get more confident and also leave less of it to trial and error. Because I'm a big believer, like I said earlier, that at this stage of our career, when we've got the craft down pat, we should not be leaving the all-important building blocks of business to chance, because somebody has done this before you. And if you follow a playbook that works, if you get mentoring from someone who's been there, done that, you're more likely to get on that faster path to impact, income, and free time. So that's what I did. I just turned to some of those mentors and got a helping hand in the areas that were less kind of known to me.
Yeah, that is... So it cannot be overstated, the importance of building community as you go independent, right? For so many reasons, not just to have people to commiserate with, right? But to learn from each other. You brought up reinventing the wheel, why, one of the things that's hardest about entrepreneurship is we try to create it all from scratch ourselves every single time. And there are brilliant people out there doing it. I have to say also, by the way, Allison, who I love, and I met her through IndeCollective. I did some work with her separate outside of IndeCollective. I was like, please take more of my money because I need to know everything. She's just a genius. She's a genius when it comes to selling in an authentic way. And when I first told her about the name of my podcast, which was at that time not Working Your Way, she said, I never do this. Can I give you some feedback? And I said, sure. She's like, it's boring. You're bolder than that. And so I ended up changing it to Working Your Way. I went back to the drawing board because Allison was like, this doesn't capture your spirit. She's like, you need something that feels like it's pushing the boundaries a little bit more. And so anyway, Allison's intrinsically linked with this podcast.
Since we're talking Allison first, I'm going to get to see Allison in person in a few weeks. She's coming to Miami, which I'm super excited about. So love Allison as a person and also just as a fabulous commercial leader and independent. I think she is a great case study of what a high achieving independent looks like. And the reason I say that is because one, she's excellent at what she does. She's been doing her thing for 15 or 20 years. I don't know the exact number of years, but for a long time. Two, she really comes at the consulting that she does with the desire to both teach and learn. And that also, frankly, has made her a fabulous member of the IndeCollective community. She came to actually participate in the program. She's now been teaching subsequently and sharing her superpowers. So that's kind of what I find. And coming back to your earlier question, how do you get on this path? And then how do you get confident and do your best work on this independent path? I think you need to have the skill set, read like your core competency that you can share with the world. And that's the baseline, right? So like, do I recommend that somebody that has yet to really develop and hone a craft, should they go independent? I'd probably say no, right? Like, make sure you know how to do your core competency with excellence. That's like the first starting block. Once that's done, you need to, I think, be looking to your left and right. And this is why IndeCollective was born, and bringing together that board of mentors, if you will, the people that have the excellence in each of those building blocks of business that can show you the playbook, coach you on how to execute it, and be an accountability as you put one foot in front of the other and get on that faster path. And Allison, is such a great case study because she's excellent at what she does, commercial leadership, and she just so happens to be like 100% in this mentality of let me both learn, let me teach, and let me team up with others to do this great work.
Let's kind of talk a bit more about community, because one of the things you just named, right, is you can have these mentors who either have done it before you, have unique skill sets that you can call on and bring them in. One of the really interesting things, so there's, accountability buddies and thought partners, but one of the things that I didn't expect to get from IndeCollective, from the community, not just the people teaching, but everybody that was in the cohort with me, was these examples of business models of people who are doing things differently. Like I call it like, there were people who were expanders for me because I had one idea in my head of how you run a business, and having like, no exaggeration, 100 different people to say, oh, they run their business this way. Oh, they start with an audit of, your marketing strategy, and that's how they get into clients. Or this person works, 10 hours a week and they charge X because they've got it so specific that the value they deliver. And, it was like just seeing all the examples for me was like such an expander. And it was it opened the door for me to think differently about my business. And so there's so many roles that community plays in IndeCollective. I just want to hear you share a little bit about why that's such a big part of the community and what it has meant for you as a solo practitioner.
Yeah, absolutely. So like to take a little bit of a step back and like give an example of like a cohort. Our typical cohorts now, we run 2 of them a year, typically one in the spring and one in the fall of the year. We only do 2 a year because we do bring together a dozen expert mentors who are teaching these interlocking building blocks of business week over 10 weeks. And we bring together a live group of people who are building their businesses. To give a snapshot of just this last graduating cohort from the fall of this last year, there's about 80 people in that cohort, people who came from 40 cities, 20 states, and 3 countries. Those people came from 18 different disciplinary backgrounds. So we had people working in DE&I and change management. We had coaches, we had consultants, people that were doing sales, marketing, the law profession, you name it, right? So it's a cross-section of people. And the beauty of having the diversity in these cohorts is that you really do, as you just said, get to see people who are further ahead, who are expanding what you think is possible. You get to see people in different swim lanes testing different business models, and it does provide that expansion. So that's the beauty of doing it kind of in this live setting with this diversity. The importance, though, is that alongside that, we have these building blocks of business that we kind of walk you through with some pre-work, interactive sessions, and next steps. And they allow you for your business at your stage of growth to really make sure you're taking the right next steps by and by. So that's a little bit about the power of community. The other thing I'll say about community for those who say, gosh, like I love working at companies because I love the camaraderie of getting to be, in accountability and finding my complements and people that have, other skill sets. The beauty of being in a community of trust is that you're able to find those people that can help you, 1, to complement your skill sets and see around corners, and 2, to team up with people, whether it be in business development, pitching and closing and delivering new work, or whether it be actually in finding the skill sets that will help you to work on your business, right? And we find that like upon graduating from a 10-week cohort, of those 80 people, about 70% will say, I'm already doing business with my peers. I'm trading referrals. I'm collaborating on projects. I'm actually using their services to build my business. That's because, I think many of us that have worked at companies and are now going independent, we still crave that interaction. We still want those compliments. We still know that we can tackle bigger, more interesting projects if we have more than just our skill set. And having that bench of really qualified, trustworthy people that can flank you is just super powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, like understanding yourself well enough to know, like when you get stuck, what do you need? Do you need time alone to think, or do you just need to pick up the phone and like talk to somebody, talk it out, talk to someone who's been there before? I think, it's one of the things where in this community, you could ask any question and there's going to be someone in your cohort that has tackled that before, right? And so I think that's also another thing of like entrepreneurship can feel like an emotional roller coaster some days, and it can feel really lonely unless you like get yourself outside of your bubble, right? And find ways to build that community and call on those resources.
Totally.
Yeah. So I'm going to wrap us up here, but I'm curious, like any parting wisdom for somebody who is currently in corporate, hasn't done anything on the side, and dreams of taking the leap? What would you tell them?
I'd say the world of work has changed. It already has changed. It's not just changing, it is totally changed. Somebody that I look up to this day and will, indefinitely is my mom. And, in the last 5 years of her career, she's 25 years my senior, she's really shifted into a portfolio of work where she's not doing a single thing for a single company full time, but is on boards, does consulting, is a coach, has written a book, right? She's doing a lot of different things. She's making the most money that she's ever made in her career at this point. And I'd say the neat thing that I see for so many of our graduates, 500 plus strong, that I've seen for myself now over the last decade, is that you don't have to pick a single swim lane, but instead, if you're great at what you do, so you have a superpower that you can share, and you start to open your awareness to what's possible and gradually put in place these building blocks of business, you can access that portfolio approach to your career, not at age 60 or 65, when many people have historically done that because they have, unfortunately, given policies, aged out of the leadership roles that they've occupied in corporate settings, but instead access it much earlier. And I think what I like to tell people when they're considering about, opening the aperture and starting to put in place these building blocks is don't wait, right? Like I've seen for myself, and you can see in the Upwork and Edelman research that a path to sure footing is quick without a lot of help. And then a path to a multiple of your free time, a multiple of your income on your terms is very possible. I've seen it for 500 plus graduates now of our program, and also a short term. So, if this is your ambition, the time is now. The world of work has already changed, and there's no reason why, if you have excellence in your craft, you shouldn't be investing in yourself to unlock that opportunity.
I love that. That is a brilliant note. And I want to just thank you for coming on and for sharing your wisdom and for building IndeCollective, because it has been such a huge part of my own journey.
Oh, thank you for having me. And it's been such a pleasure.
Yeah. Thanks, Sam. All right. There was a lot of information in this episode. I encourage you to do some reflection and then maybe give parts of it a second listen. Just to review a little bit, there are so many ways to go independent. I hope you were able to take away some new ideas of what independent work could look like for you, whether it's truly a solo venture or something collaborative within an agency or partnering with someone else, and what type of work you want to do, meaning how do you want to deliver your expertise? It could be through coaching or consulting or advising or doing fractional work. And then lastly, I hope you took away some things that you should consider if you are thinking about going independent. As you know, with everything I do, there's no black or white or yes or no answer. It's all about weighing these factors and making the best decision for you. Some of the success stories and examples you heard in this episode can help you challenge some of your own limiting beliefs that may have been holding you back. And at the same time, I think we gave a pretty realistic perspective on what it's really like to run a business, not just deliver the work that you love to do. I encourage you to do some self-reflection about what you need to thrive from a career standpoint. And really get honest with yourself about what might be the best fit for you, whether that's working in an organization, doing your own thing, or possibly somewhere in the middle. I'm going to link a couple of articles in the show notes that talk more about independent work, including the ones that reference some of the data that we mentioned in this episode. If you're ready to take some action, maybe you put the word out to your network and start to do a little bit of independent work on the side and test it out first. Or maybe you start by going on your own coffee tour to learn about what's out there and expand your current view. And then sit down and map out your vision of what a great life and career really look like to you. If you have more questions about going independent that we didn't answer in this episode, I would love to hear them. Reach out to me on LinkedIn or Instagram or through my website, selfatwork.com.